Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval Southern Italian and Sicilian warfare between the 11th and the 14th century. I plan to cover this in at least 2 videos because the subject matter is very vast, as we have also had the chance of observing in related videos such as the ones we made, for example, on North African and Sicilian warfare during the same period, excluding Sicily essentially after the Christian reconquest of the island. So just in that case, for a tiny time, we made a series on Sicilian history for the historical regional series with a video for every single medieval domination that this land had. We didn't talk too much about Sicilian and Southern Italian history at large. I think we never even covered Sardinia in a specific video at least, so there is a lot actually to dig into it. Today's video will partially actually cover Sardinia as well, I say partially because there is not as much evidence as for southern Italy that was more developed in general, but it's one of those topics that definitely deserves important attention. And here we cover for the historical regional warfare series in the heart of the Middle Ages. It may take a while to finish, definitely. So there is definitely divide that we could appreciate on Schwerpunkt, considering the relevance that, of course, especially for a medieval history-based channel, Central and Northern Italy have for the period in question. The fact that definitely in the Middle Ages that was overall the more developed part of the peninsula as well, its islands, and that is as a consequence also the single best documented practically in the world at the time. So Southern Italy and Sicily are distinct from that. They had a different history, at least from the early Middle Ages, even though certain dynamics that contributed to sort of isolate this land from the ever more continentally based European developments began very early. You can argue actually since the Roman conquest. In that time, especially the Hellenic colonized coastland was far more advanced, say, than especially Po Valley. But in hindsight, when you look at also antiquity at large, this happens often for reasons that I'm not going to digress on. This idea that Southern Italy just was this incredibly flawed. Also during, for example, the Arab domination, there is a bit this myth that still is such a rich and developed place. In part, it is true. Definitely, this is true for most of Europe and even certain parts of Italy at the same time. But when you actually look at the relative terms of how things were faring politically and administratively, you realize, first of all, that since the Lombards invasions, practically Southern Italy was politically divided in so many different chunks with different backs and forths. You have the Saracens later that occupy Sicily and certain parts of the southern Italian coastland. You have the Byzantine reconquest, etc. And basically it's not until the Normans so after almost half of a millennium, that this land reacquires a political unity, or at least a single sovereign that attempted, in fact, at that point, with great effort, to put back things together from communities that had importantly diversified, and in part, in fact, become very, relatively distant from one another culturally wise. This is important for our topic because it is true for the various military traditions that existed in this place. There's also extensively large. Admittedly, most of the hinterland is mountainous. There are very few coastal plains. You have mostly the Apulian Plateau, and then Sicily being pretty much also a world on its own with great historical relevance, and especially because of the grain exports that during these very centuries we are discussing here became to literally feed Italy, parts of Europe, even North Africa, Egypt. So a complete inversion what was actually the case for ancient times, where it was Europe that had to get food from Tunisia, from Egypt, etc. And this speaks, of course, of the massive trade shift that had occurred in the balance between the Christian and the Islamic world, that southern Italy had been in the midst of, probably being the frontier area. There would be so much to say. Again, I realize I don't even remember how many videos I made about southern Italy so far, but it's not much, right? Especially compared to the rest of the peninsula. But we have to catch up a bit and re-equilibrate the proportions, because even for explaining these strictly military or broadly military topics, of course, you need to know the history, you need to know the politics and the society behind that. I think this region is very underrated in medieval times, also in the early modern era, and it should be more properly studied. It is true that already at this point, for the few data I gave you, and you can understand this from like this region was already separate from the rest of the peninsula in many ways. During the first few years of our period, Sicily remains under Islamic rule, and parts of the mainland under the Byzantine one. We discussed these in the videos we already made, as I was saying before, on North African and Sicilian warfare and the Byzantine one, respectively, because we observed, especially like the Arab presence, the Islamic influences, and also the, for example, forms of Byzantine militia, levy system, especially in the cities of the Southern Italian mainland. They were actually the most advanced militias in the entire Byzantine world. In fact, as we learn now, and as we know just in general from other videos, compare in fact to the rest of the Byzantine world, we're just discussing it today, Southern Italy was actually the most relatively urbanized, and also sort of absolutely urbanized, considering also the very high level of endemic concentration. The extension of urbanization historically from an Italic point of view, a Roman point of view, like probably in the continent, right, in the interland, differently from the Hellenic world that had been mostly, actually exclusively coastal in nature, and that the Byzantines had continued a bit like in this way. So actually what we call as Byzantine Italy was not much of a Byzantine thing. It was incredibly similar, it's also in the essentials of military organization, to the Lombard part of the country, as this was a substantially decentralized land that the Byzantines themselves were not prioritizing historically. It would come back at a point, reconquering especially many coastal areas successfully, but by the 40s of the 11th century, as we will see now, they bail out once again. They're going through a crisis that is the one of the end of the Macedonian dynasty, to bring to the rise of the Komnenians. And there are very significant transformations that allow, by the way, the Normans to rise in southern Italy. If the Byzantine government in southern Italy had continued with greater stability, we would have not heard of the Normans of Sicily, right, of southern Italy, and their very powerful kingdom. So everything is much more intertwined than our poor time availability here allows us to fully cover. But it's important to bear it in mind and to look at other videos I made on these various topics. So the arms and armor of this region, let's call it the region, even though, again, there is this debatable separation between Sicily, the southern Italy, etc. More of that later regarding strictly cultural aspects. During this time, we have already in part seen, like in the very first period in the aforementioned videos. Then you have the independent and semi-independent cities and duchies of 11th century southern Italy, and that we cover here. Essentially, after the Normans conquer southern Italy and Sicily in 1076 and 1088, this area falls under their general control, hegemony, dominion. The Normans do not immediately and notoriously control all of this territory, especially these quasi-cities, states, so you can say city-states by approximation. They were not real states as we intend them, because even the central northern Italian ones would develop fully that only much later. These were more like autonomous cities that had some essentially republican but still essentially oligarchic government, part of Byzantine origin, just like Venice, just to say. Naples was not formally taken over by the Normans until 1140, but as a great coastal market and port had been effectively dominated by them for many years. And this is true for many other centers. You can argue, of course, there was an important difference between all these, across all this region. We've seen the ex-Islamic Sicily, the ex-Byzantine Calabria, Apulia. You have these cities, these maritime republics, essentially of Gaeta, Naples, and Amalfi. You have the ex-Longobards Salerno, Benevento, and Capua in the hinterland. However, even though these lands were, in fact, had been under different dominations, they were at large still Italic. They were historically, since antiquity, part of that, especially in the hinterland of that very world. Yes, the coastal cities were Greek. Their establishment was very much connected with the Byzantine world, because they were Greek-speaking communities, but they, as we were saying before, had historically developed their own distinctiveness. They had been born as, sometimes back in the day, literally in antiquity, as Hellenic colonies themselves. Others were really early medieval. I made a video, for example, medieval Amalfi, explaining this. What I mean here is that there was a broader Italian culture anyway. This hyper emphasis on how mixed or weird or broken in a essentially cultural, ethnic, or identitaristic sense, Southern Italy was a bit of a fiction from sort of later criticism of how, especially backward by the 19th century, before the Italian unification, this system had become. Surely suffering in part of this, because again, especially the early medieval destructuration of a unitary rule in Southern Italy was to be deeply felt. But I mean, overall, even the Greek presence it's very overstated in Germany. It's the one that people want to show you because they want to sort of blow your mind. Oh, look, there were Greeks living here. It's like another country now. The hinterland was overwhelmingly and actually exclusively Italian in a sense. And then the coasts were, of course, very much Greek influenced, but much also of that Greekness stemmed from this medieval contact rather than an actual continuity from ancient times, at least in the actual inhabitants that, of course, had strong connections, especially in Italy, with an hinterland that, as we were pointing out before, was not the typical, the Greek would say the one of Greece historically. It was one in which Rome had founded, like throughout all the West, many cities that had always been also part of that Italic background stock that worked in an incredibly different way still at this point as a concept for how it had developed compared to the Byzantine Greek world. And this aspect is actually very underrated, and we shall look at it way more in depth in other videos. In fact, another aspect that it's worth pointing out is that in spite of the several foreign dominations, conquests, etc., of southern Italy as a whole, the cultural and military technological identity of this region essentially survives throughout the centuries, and it basically maintains its own distinctiveness, especially crystallizing for good after especially the 40s with the mid 14th century crisis. Basically, it's when the main essentials between northern, central, and southern Italy are practically separated. You have probably a Southern Italian area that is historically, culturally, linguistically going on its own, and that's the ancien regime kicking in, the regionalization, the satellisation is various chunks of Europe, and Southern Italy goes. Also, it's a pretty big system, telling the truth. One of the largest in Europe, in this sense also militarily underrated, because they constantly had a remarkable military force throughout the later period. The main fracture, if anything, occurred in 1282 within the system. That is, of course, the Sicilian Vespers causing it. You have the Aragonese taking over Sicily, and the Angevins from Naples trying, by the way, relentlessly with an incredible amount of military force to recover the island, albeit unsuccessfully. The two regions would not be reunited until 1442, when the Aragonese take over Naples. I made recently, by the way, a video about the Aragonese government of Naples, exactly during the 15th century. Another notorious as fascinating aspect of southern Italy is the survival of the Longobards presence, at least as the ramp states what had been once the direct Longobard rule of Italy. Of course, the Longobard kingdom had practically become the Italic one. The Longobards, even when at a point ruled by the Carolingians, the Ottonians are still there. So that word has practically become Italian as this one. But the Langobardia Minor, that is the southern Italian, actually central, south part of the central and the southern Italian duchies, that also split over time after the Carolingian conquest of the Langobardia Minor in the north, are in fact the direct political continuation of Longobard rule. They had somewhat remained historically autonomous since the foundation of the Longobard kingdom, but contrary to what is commonly believed, especially and paradoxically, even probably the southern ones were absolutely not some sort of independent states that were phobic to the recognition of the capital of Pavia, whatever. On the contrary, like the more disobedient was Spoleto, whereas Benevent was actually pretty big and powerful, had also its own king in Pavia, and it was pretty cooperative overall. And this area had remained, the Longobards were installed in the hinterland. Historically, the Byzantines had retained the coastlands, thus turning the hinterland into a nightmarish frontier between the Carolingian, later Ottonian, etc. Empire and the Byzantine one, which none of the two powers ever managed to take over. Like, it would take the Normans to do so. And also because, just like the Saracens, this had been called into southern Italy, without which the thing would have really never happened otherwise, as mercenaries themselves. That's another very complicated story to tell, and we have to discuss it more thoroughly. In fact, in the light of who actually kept also ruling to an extent after the Normans came around, because these had great difficulties in controlling the Apenninic hinterland, and most of it had settled in Sicily. That was the more easily governable one, whereas the southern Italian reality, especially in the hinterland, was very much entrenched in its own autonomies and prerogatives, and it's basically even foreshadowing the power of the barons that would later on simply take over the system, and also in that case requiring its support in order to rule the land. To begin with, whoever you were, you came from the external. In some ways, the Longobard military system had maintained levels of archaisms, at least since it had not been properly conquered by the Holy Roman Empire, and still receiving some influence from the same. It had retained some characteristics that were less feudal, right? Some of which were Byzantine or even properly late Roman in origin. You know that it seems that the first Longobards to be settled in Italy were not the ones who invaded from the north, like the main people settled around the Balaton Lake before the migration into the peninsula, but some Longobard veterans of the Gothic War that the Byzantines left, specifically in Benevento. This is witnessed by some military titles and organization that, in fact, these Longobards retained differently from the ones of the center of the north. There is, of course, some Germanic tradition proper of that also makes it all more common to the rest of Italy to an extent. There is, in fact, we were talking about it in that video about the Italic roots of the peninsula, ethnically speaking, that there is an unbroken Indo-European Italic presence that runs down the Apennines and is actually very strong in central and southern Italy as well. Historically, many lands of the hinterland are actually also genetically speaking very conservative. Speaking of those ancient migrations, very different the coastal area that instead is very connected with the Byzantine world, as we'll see now, the rest of the Mediterranean during this period. So you have actually important differences within the system as well. Military service was normally a personal matter, not being linked to the holding of land, at least not in comparison to the feudal system that by this point had developed in post-Carolingian Europe, also pretty close and sort of again by osmosis being partially received in before the arrival of the Normans. But everything was in fact more leaning towards sort of the Byzantine side of the balance, always considering that Italy had uninterruptedly maintained the highest per capita wealth in the world since Roman times, and so that these local systems of organization are not necessarily just, a Byzantine or a Germanic legacy, but have roots in that Romano-Italic background, at least in the balance of for example, this individual wealth and consequent political and social relations reflected in the levy, right? Generally speaking, you have, in fact, similarly to central and northern Italy, the local aristocracy at least being drawn towards the city or the town. In, say, France or Germany, most noblemen lived in the castles, right? However, this is also a heavily fortified and urbanized world. Remember that encastellation in Italy starts very early, already in the 10th century. Say in the Baltic, you have to wait for the second half of the 12th. So obviously there were many more resources and think about all the Roman infrastructure. The urbanization of the landscape that had favored, of course, these forms of political association, the rule from this city that was typically also Lombard because of the Roman influence. Of course, made lots of videos on this very topic. The church, like in other parts of Europe, we've seen it also recently, was involved in the supply of troops from the later 10th century. At least that is when it's documented, but it existed also before. There was a lot of church lands in southern Italy historically. That's also why the papacy had always had a very strong interest in the south, because originally the papal latifundia, say in late antiquity, had been concentrated there. Like Sicily had a lot of those, for example, that were lost after the Arab conquest. As you know, the Byzantines at some point enacted the iconoclastic persecutions of monasteries, especially because some parts of the empire, including these ones, were pretty big, rich ones. And later, the same Normans are infiltrated as papal vassals into southern Italy. Its church not being controlled by the Norman kings in the way, the French or the English rulers would historically, because the Pope had that closer connection to them. Rome was also pretty close. And there were lots of dioceses, like tens of them. Certain parts of Central Europe just had a bunch, right? So it's actually a very hypertrophic land. The problem is always that it's very fragmented, it's very disorderly. So that it has a lot of power, but because of all these centuries spent without a central authority that controls the whole organically, structurally, allowing for a more unitary development, it's all fragmented from the within like this. There is this notion that the Longobards would have been weaker in cavalry compared to the Normans. Some say that this may be an oversimplification, applying only to certain areas which were in revolt against the Byzantines when the Normans themselves arrived, which is surely true. However, it's important to stress, as we were saying before, that the Southern Longobards hadn't developed the same level of feudalism that the Franks had exported pretty much everywhere in the post-Carolingian world, including central, northern Italy. So even though surely this Longobard cavalry would have not looked very different from the one of the Italic kingdom that paradoxically was also the Longobard one, and in fact the post-Carolingian world, they would have had less of that, right? They would have had less comprehensive structure. See, when the Normans take over southern Italy, they create unprecedented seigneuries by extensional size in loco that had ever been before. Like there's probably a Western Frankish mentality. There were actually lots of Italians within that. We will talk about that later in other peoples, but it is real, say, feudalism to a scale that the local lords historically had not seen. Not just in the Byzantine world, that naturally had much less of that, but also among the Longobards, that, however, remain often entrenched into their own strongholds. Some of them actually dedicate themselves to the papacy. For example, Benevent would notoriously remain a papal enclave, like, I don't know, Avignon later, into this case the Kingdom of Sicily, as it was called, even though, of course, we're talking about southern, that would formally be established in the 12th century, before all these lands were sort of packed together with different titles that the Hauteville rulers shared within their family before obtaining by the Pope the royal crown. So yeah, we will talk at some point about Southern Longobard cavalry of these years, because it's really fascinating. They had very tough units, but say the systemic feudal system that could produce that top-notch, thickly packed, shock charge, incredibly effective system. We've seen it in action at the Battle of the Aragonese, etc. It's really something beyond the systemic means of the Longobards, specifically in southern Italy. They were, if anything, just also smaller powers. Even though the Normans really took over, as we were saying, from the within. They have also Sicily, and so that's also very neatly organized, as it wasn't a feudal land before. So we're actually, it was easier to establish it as a feudal system controlled by your own guys, right, rather than having to strip it from others. And in fact, the Longobards, as we were saying, were very difficult to take out from their nests. A bit what happened in England, right? No prior feudal system. So aside from the harrying of the north, the system was taken over in a single battle. Sicily took actually longer, but it was much less bloody. Lots of sieges methodically carried out one by one, but not much of a great bloodshed. Many, not most, of the Muslims coming back to Tunisia, and the Normans managing to, that knew also Sicily from before. They had already been serving local Islamic rulers that they knew it would help them at some point, even by converting or remaining temporarily integrated in the system. This happens similarly to the Reconquista, but it's also a very different reality. You see in cities as Naples, Bari, and surely other centers, an estate of militias and burgess knights already existing by this point. It's kind of obvious. The term miles has nothing strictly technical. Of course, these were heavy cavalrymen, and they lived, again, like in the rest of Italy, as such, like in the cities rather than in the countryside, where of course they had their own residences and possessions, but they had this different location and cultural exposure. These centers were also strongly Byzantine in some cases, Bari for example. So as we were saying before, it was not just about the major local Italian style, but it was, of course, Byzantine aristocracy as well that would have militias themselves, that in Italy especially looked very much more similar to the ones of the peninsula than, say, I don't know, the ones of the Balkans or Anatolia. Some of these militias would be enfeoffed by the Normans shortly after their conquest of these lands. Because, of course, it's not like they eradicated whoever was there. No, they negotiated the whole thing. In some cases, there was a violent confrontation, but most of the system was simply integrated. There is an interesting indicator that the infantry garrison troops often seem not to have been of free origin, which is similar to what you see in Germany, for example, with the ministeriales. And here we shall look a bit more in depth to it at some point to understand who these people were, how they had emerged in that way, where it was just like a Norman subjugation of some local populace, a more brutal dealing with, say, from a northern feudal point of view, of some people that had been, as we've seen here, less under some sort of smaller, lower control, and therefore actually a bit freer, but in the Norman eyes not being worth of such, recognition as far as the practicalities of the very, of course, strong occupation needed to maintain these areas that would rebel often, right? Again, the local Lombard nobility especially, but other also Norman barons would do so, right? The center of the Haute-Ville was Sicily, but southern Italy at some point really behaved very autonomously, and it was truly like another country. Now, the military heritage of this region reflects, of course, Islamic influence that went on during this period, because, of course, across the sea you have North Africa that would also keep providing Arab or, say, Berber, before invaders, like back in the day, now mercenaries, even settling in Sicily. We made a video about the sub-Saharan mercenaries in places like Spain, Sicily, and we've seen how actually they were keeping to come there. There were also, of course, Christian knights that were serving, say, in the guards of Tunisian or Algerian rulers. So there was a lot of movement, military-wise, also slave soldiers, etc. We'll talk more about these. There were some interesting, black cavalry guards at some point used by the Haute-Ville kings. As you understand, also the more interesting part are the Saracen troops of Sicily proper, that the Norman rulers as they take over these communities. We say Saracens, but this is a bit like Spain during the Conquest. It's not like these were literally the descendants, full-blooded descendants of those Berbers, essentially, with Arabized elites that had invaded Sicily back in the day. They were mostly just Sicilians, and to an extent, yes, they had been converted to Islam, etc., and that to an extent, were emarginated, especially after the Norman conquest, reason for which they were, as it happens often with individuals of different religions, we're just mentioning it, heavily dependent on the local monarchs that tend to often use foreigners and or these allogen elements, either religiously or culturally, ethnically, to have people that are fanatically loyal, because without their protection they would be essentially taken out by the locals, that of course are not even that happy to have just Muslims into a Christian country. Consider that there were lots of Westerners immigrating into Sicily, right? There are some Gallo-Roman islands in the very center of Sicily that date back to, in fact, to the Norman conquest and occupation of places like Enna. That, you know, if you control that, it's because you control Sicily, right? And they came from places like Lombardy. Again, when you say Normans, it's a synecdoche, of course. There were lots of people from actual Normandy. There were lots of Bretons, of Flemish, of Lombards. You name them, really. We'll see it better later. In all this, consider that the Southern Italian ports, for example, the great maritime republics of Amalfi, had historically, and would continue at this point, having trade contacts, to say the least, with the Islamic world, broadly meant. The Italians are taking over, essentially, what had been historically like the Islamic trade space. They fight against the Saracens, they crush them, and they control essentially the entire sea. The Amalfitans are actually the first to do this. Amalfi is incredibly rich, and if you just know how the place is made, like there is a mountain that separates it from the rest of the hinterland. You have the sea in the front, and so the Normans take forever in the passes behind that on the mountains to even reach it, to be able to take it. And you understand that because of this trade contact, there keeps being, as we will see from the various iconographic archaeological evidence, to be lots of influences coming from the Islamic world, even just aesthetically in styles, types of arms and armor that really are, if not, are not just sometimes properly made in places like North Africa, but they're actually replicated by local Italian craftsmen that historically had also been trading, especially in these areas with the Saracens. Amalfi had actually been staunchly anti-Saracen historically, so this actually means a lot. They would still sort of adopt part of their styles. Some other of these maritime republics like Gaeta had even allied themselves with the Saracens against basically everybody else at that point for reasons of obvious maritime wealth. Nobody really conquered ever these cities, nor the Saracens could, because they lacked the means to do so. So actually the entire story of the Saracen presence, first of all, knowing who the Saracens were, because many Saracens, we think Saracens, there were even Christians among them, and coming from Italy, from Spain. So there is, again, this a bit of an obsession for the idea of the Saracens swarming, sowing their seed everywhere. And actually, especially if you study southern Italy during the second invasions, realize that practically they heavily depended on the same southern Italians at large for doing what they did. And if they managed to enter the region, it was only because there were say Lombard rulers paying them to go fight against their rivals in the region, etc. So it's actually a much more messed up and complicated story that does bring evidently also to these military influences. And that, however, get down essentially, aside from the Saracens of Sicily, just to material influence, not really organizational systems, also because there wasn't even in Islamic Sicily this great deal of peculiar, first of all, much of an actual impact civilizationally of Islam. If anything, just Palermo was a big market, but politically speaking, the system was incredibly fragmented, and so you don't have something so similar, I don't know, to the Byzantine system, or to the Lombard system, or to the Frankish system, and so on. It's even possible, actually it's very likely, that the same Christian community within Islamic Sicily had retained some form of military role that was eventually inherited by the Normans when they took over the island. Because, yes, of course, not everybody was Islamic. Actually, Sicily put up, even when abandoned by Constantinople, an atrocious resistance against Muslim conquest. They, in fact, took generations before fully controlling the entire island. Local troops were similarly available in the ex-Byzantine areas after these were conquered by the Normans as well. The defense of such provinces having already passed to local forces anyway after the Byzantine thematic armies were disbanded in the region around, as we were saying, the 40s of the 11th century. And so they were already organizing themselves by themselves, and with this also progressed form of military organization we were talking about. If you're interested in a bit more of a distant time, I made a video about the Byzantine militarization of the Italic landowners between the 7th to 8th century, because the Longobards had actually the upper hand in Italy, and the Byzantines weren't making much of an effort to even take it back, and so they allowed a system of essentially military organization was very much similar to the one the St. Longobards have. And so you understand how really similar to an extent they were. Although the Normans naturally played the dominant role in their conquest of southern Italy and Sicily, there were, as hinted at before, lots of different peoples involved in this. Bretons, Flemings, Poitevins, Angevins, also Italians, and others, Germans, you name it, there are plenty of them from all over the West, which brings, however, pretty uniformly in loco, Western, say, Frankish military styles. I mean, all these peoples essentially fought in the same way because they were the core of what the Carolingian Empire had been, and they all import what you would typically think of a Norman-like, right? Of course, the Normans are quite fascinating, beautiful, we will talk about them more, but we should also realize that aside perhaps from a bit more of a moral primitive kick from that Norse background, and aside from the fact that we called Normans people that actually had nothing to do with that, their equestrian skills, their feudalism was completely identical, just as their organization, their load, even their language, to the Western Frankish one, right? So we say the Normans, but again, basically anybody in, say, the Western Frankish kingdom, in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, in the Kingdom of Italy, etc., would pretty much perform in the same way. After the Norman conquest of southern Italy, there was considerable feudalization, of course, of the countryside, while towns were garrisoned by government troops. I will not digress on how useful, of course, the progressed administration, general civilization of southern Italy was for the Normans to build up that flower of a kingdom that was truly the strongest in Europe at a point. Like if you look at their military laws of recruitment, they had on parchment a stronger military than the English one. That was also very common under same Anglo-Normans. It was actually a much more centralized system, even than England, whose royal power was notoriously very concentrated by Latin Germanic standards at the point, even, in fact, the greatest after Sicily, however. In theory, the entire male population had a military role, but in reality only a minority were called upon, which is really normal. In general, this applies also to the aforementioned baronial knightly availability. I mean, yes, you could count this empirical ways, thanks also to these documents that are pretty precise for the times being of the list of all the knights available in the kingdom, but of course the political means to mobilize them is a completely different story, right? This doesn't mean, however, that they weren't active, right? And we're talking the Middle Ages here, also, again, quite developed places and during the booming of Western civilization, so there actually were lots of military resources, even when they couldn't properly be controlled by the kings. In fact, notoriously, some of the greatest Siculo-Norman campaigns being fought with enormous efforts were direct against the same southern Italy, or the rebels that we were talking about before, without mentioning, of course, in all of this, still the vital threat that the Siculo-Normans posed to the Byzantine Empire entirely. Robert Guiscard being very candid about the fact that he wanted to conquer Constantinople, and southern Italy would be the launch pad for possible invasions of conquest of Constantinople under Henry VI of Swabia, under Charles of Anjou, if it hadn't been for the Sicilian Vespers. So we're really talking about massive military assets. Sicily had the least militarized population of the whole region, because the Arabs had not had essentially a feudal system, nor the Longobards or the Byzantines as we've seen, but these had sort of more compact military structures and statehood, political stability. So Sicily, as we were pointing out before, was also easier to conquer, to subjugate and to rule. It was also pretty fertile, pretty rich, so there wasn't really much of a desperate effort even to resist the Norman conquest, also considering that the majority of Sicilians was not happy of the Islamic presence. However, it's exactly the marginalization of the Muslims, those who remained in Sicily, living mostly as brigands, raiders, throat cutters, etc., would provide the most relevant military force to at least the kingdom as a whole. We explained why. It's not like that Sicily as a whole did not have militias or even also a naval potential. Even technically wise, there were pretty advanced communities that also contributed largely from a logistical infrastructural point of view to the development of the realm. But exactly because these were the Muslims were, remaining Muslims were desperate, they would devote themselves to the monarchy as soldiers to provide, in fact, with this extra military service under the threat of otherwise annihilation. At some point, there were bearing relations, really. The same Sicilian monarchs allowed some sort of pogroms of the Muslims, etc. So when you think about this, oh my God, this was such tolerant war. No, there wasn't such like the idea of tolerance, at least as we develop in the modern sense. It was more just like a balance of estates. Of course, Christians hated Muslims and vice versa. It's not like the Norman kings liked the Muslims just per se. But of course, like the broader Islamic world had remained not particularly underdeveloped. There was trade, there were contacts. As you know, the same Sicilian court hosted many Muslim scholars, etc., from Spain, from other parts of the Mediterranean, also contributing, in fact, to the peak of magnificence, especially of the 12th, 13th century Sicilian court that was really the marvel of the world. However, these people were irregimented properly in this more brutal reality. They could be quite rebellious, rowdy in many ways. The way they would be deported to northern Apulia, the strategic town of Lucera that the Romans in fact had once created as a colony to control the region, were brought that by Frederick II, who literally disemboweled with his own spear in front of all this captured Muslims. Now that the leader of the umpteenth revolt that had occurred, he deported them there, so making them even more isolated, in this sense, even more loyal and inescapable. And as you know, during the 13th century, the Saracens of Frederick's Guard, etc., figure importantly also in the wars against the Lombard League in the north, etc. The Angevins, when taking over southern Italy, used them too for a while, then they exterminate them. entirely. We do not really know how many Saracens existed in Lucera by that time. However, we see that they could provide several thousand soldiers at a point. We will have to talk about them because, again, the exotic curiosity prevailed on history, unfortunately, in scholarship as well to an extent. And for a long time it was believed that these Saracens were so much, revitalizing the Western art of war, at least in the army of Frederick II. It's a big deal, that they were more flexible, whatever. Not much. Actually, the same power of Frederick II on its Sicilian power base, it was really big in terms of the absolute size, of course, of a major feudal kingdom, has been, however, heavily redimensioned in actual quality compared to, say, for example, the Lombard communal armies of the north that also, in fact, won against Frederick's armies at the end, towards the end of his life. And so, like, the Western art of war was actually going towards a very different direction, including in Sicily, where in the late Swabian era you can see essentially German mercenaries used, paid in money proper, as the Sicilian barons had proven over and over not to be particularly reliable, at least in fealty. That's also the reason why the Hauteville decide to marry with the Hohenstaufen instead of giving the crown to some local baron that would sort of destabilize the system further. But this is pretty much like the story of every feudal kingdom. Hence also this preference at a point for foreign rulers. This was true for, Poland, Hungary, the Byzantine Empire, and more. The value of these Siculo-Muslim troops, however, is good. Right, they did provide objectively with that tactical variety. Also, apparently, technical, logistical skills of sort. They were surely useful on campaign. Just they were not a game changer. They even included cavalry. Some of them were armed with a bow. So yes, there were horse archers in Sicily. As actually, horse archers. Mounted crossbowmen, etc., were present in Western warfare, but here coming from a different military tradition, the Islamic one, for probably lighter purposes than the also tendentially more elite Western mounted crossbowmen, for example. We'll talk more about this, especially when observing Iberian warfare, because there is a lot of that, not only a lot of stuff of this kind was, of course, present in the Byzantine military, as we know. In fact, some of these troops would actually stem even, there might have been a Muslim from Sicily that, however, fought in ways that were heavily influenced historically by the Byzantines. Just to make the story simpler, there would have been some Muslims that looked pretty much Western in terms of arms and armor, living in Sicily during the Norman conquest, obviously. In any case, it's the Western art of war that prevails in pretty much everything, as we will see now in the iconographic and archaeological evidence. We do find a lot of that sort of lighter bias, apparently, but it is in part also just a stylistic rhetoric, we could say, because of course there was a lot of Byzantine art influence, also Islamic art influence, and in part these are just fantasy depictions and or ones of troops that you could have found there. However, there doesn't seem to have been a particularly light bias for Siculo-Norman armies per se. Right? If anything, there were present as sort of auxiliary forces, but the bulk of the army revolved around the heavily armored, mounted elite. The most famous specialty of these Saracens were archers, which can't be a decisive arm by definition, so that auxiliary function is evidently well served. However, there were heavy infantrymen as well. I mean, they would have had a tactically complete organization just shifted in bias towards this lighter missile element. The bulk of heavily armored cavalry and infantry forces was provided by the Normans, the Italians, and other Christian communities, including the Byzantine ones. It is true, of course, there were important Byzantine Greek communities in southern Italy. Especially the monastic assets were really impressive, and surely there were troops coming from there, even though we know practically nothing of how this service was regulated, also because, as we've seen, there was the Pope in between, so the Norman kings couldn't quite do everything they wanted with that. But given that these were not Roman Catholic centers, sometimes the thing could sort of be bypassed. I talked about this in the video, in fact, about the early days of Norman rule in Sicily, that addresses exactly some of these topics. It explains really how also the baronies were organized, how much they had to contribute to the army, etc. In fact, while most of them were a bit more typically living in castles in the countryside, etc., many knights were provided by the urban militias, as well as by, for example, Northern Italian mercenaries. The important role of Italian troops in both the initial conquest and in the subsequent Italo-Norman armies has in fact only recently been recognized in its greater importance. We're not talking just knights, we're talking especially the infantry, the logisticians, all the military engineers that helped dramatically, the sailors, the marines, etc., that all helped the Normans, that bringing a bit more of a snobbish feudal culture and literature wouldn't, especially in the earlier times of the Siculo-Norman dominion, document such forces. Is really normal, like also in the rest of feudal Europe, that infantry is always a bit neglected by the sources, but we know that especially in southern Italy that there was a lot of that kind of manpower labor force up to such diversified and specialized tasks. Remember that the same Norman conquest of southern Italy is part of the broader impetus of the Crusades, of the support from the Italian maritime republics, the broadly meant Frankish mercenaries, that in fact the Normans really were. So there is really also a lot of external support against the Byzantines, against the Muslims in general. It's sort of difficult in this more feudal southern Italian society to document this, as you could see it from central or northern Italy already at this point. We're freer and sort of more communal, more autonomous and expressive, we can say, also from a documentary point of view. This is a bit like the problem we have with southern Italy also for the following centuries, that we know actually that there were communes even there, right? There were interesting systems of military organization, but unfortunately they're not as well documented as in the rest of the peninsula, which of course immediately shows how they were less developed in comparison. However, they also contributed in ways that we can't see unless we look at, of course, the narrative sources. We say, wow, for example, the Southern Italian armies were pretty big and seemingly actually very similar, especially in later times, to basically the broader Italian art of war. It was perhaps the single most advanced by the 13th to 14th century in Europe, in the world. I made a video about the Italo-Norman horsemen of the 11th century that I didn't name knight exactly to stress how he could come also from, say, those southern Lombard places, and having actually a sort of very advanced chivalric equestrian cultures were pointed out in that case for the same Longobards, but even certain one of these guys from former Byzantine city militias would have actually had a very interesting equestrian culture. I'm actually preparing a video on the Byzantine war horse of say, the crusading era, right? So there's always a lot to cover there. Mercenaries from abroad, by the way, became increasingly important in the Siculo-Norman royal armies during the 12th century, just as they did elsewhere in Europe. Just as a form of organization, it could also be locals, all right? But it's probably the initial sort of archaic feudal system that is being unhinged, surpassed by the increasing monetization, the availability of these adventurers, etc. Nevertheless, militias, urban and rural, seem to have survived as vital elements in most such armies. Indeed, this region could provide a consistent amount of foot troops that were also, again, pretty good, especially compared to whatever, I don't know, the Byzantines or the Arabs could oppose them. There is this question mark on the personal freedom involved. Definitely in central northern Italy, the communal armies, both in the citizen and peasant element, are freemen, right? There is a very strong, actually the strongest tradition of juridical freedom in Europe, in these centers. To begin with, in southern Italy, things could have been more blurred, but we're also, unfortunately, and again, not documented enough to realize this. When you look at the subsequent Swabian and Angevin dominations of this southern Italian and Sicilian state, you see that aside from the overall Western development in the art of war, there isn't much of a specific change based on the region. First of all, both the Swabians and the Angevins tended to preserve the political and military system that the Normans had established. It was pretty darn good, as we were saying before. And that, however, irreparably began to decline during the various strifes, the minority of Frederick II, the papal invasions, the general destructuring of the kingdom in itself. It split after the Vespers. Especially Sicily at that point undergoes a severe crisis. Actually, southern Italy is much more developed at that point, and that's also why the Angevins ruled from Naples. There were very specific reasons, also the closeness to Rome and to the east and more. But Sicily, essentially Aragonese Sicily, is less powerful than Angevin Naples. The latter, however, was part of a bigger system that now, in fact, has lost a pretty important chunk of the same, and actually earning an enemy just across the Strait of Messina. Throughout these centuries, the bulk of the broader Sicilian forces, Sub-Sicilian, Southern Italian, are typically Western. Aside from the aforementioned Saracens of Lucera in particular, the armies are, again, heavy cavalry plus infantry support, some pretty advanced level of technical capacities. And it's pretty similar to any other sort of Western feudal monarchy without any specific distinction. The possession and carrying of arms was strictly controlled in the mid-13th century by the Hohenstaufen. At the same time, a number of interesting technical developments were seen in southern Italian arms and armor, especially in the 13th century, the beginning of the 14th. Some have wanted to see a continuity in Islamic or Byzantine influences, but they do not seem to have been particularly strong. In any case, we see things like, short, relatively at least short stabbing swords and large basilar thrusting daggers that are, however, spreading pretty much everywhere in the West, also because I will make a video about the Battle of Benevent right? There is a bit this myth that, let's say, that the Angevins had developed some sort of lighter cavalry to cope Mediterranean style to simply wrestle against the Germans that had spread for the, say, first the plate armor, and so just to stab with these daggers the exposed armpits of the enemy knights. They were actually pretty much the same, but of course these developments are occurring, just they have nothing particular to do with local traditions, or at least it's practically impossible to trace this, like, something that spreads so far and wide is evidently just stemming from a common need and background. We see mounted crossbowmen, which however are also serving as mounted infantry at some point. We see a lot of hardened leather cuirassier armor in the early and mid 14th century, but these were part of a broader, we've seen Provençal, Angevin, Tuscan style, where at least it becomes typical. It's possible that either because of the heat or maybe this greater bias towards lighter warfare, some sort, would have played a role from these lands that were so central, after all, in the military developments. I mean, everybody was fighting, as you know, at this point for controlling this state. The major houses in Europe, so you can never really say what really influenced the interest of actual, percentage were we to calculate. It's practically impossible. As we were saying before, there is practically no other particularly distinctive aspect of Southern Italian warfare. The more time goes on, basically by the 14th century, Danish or Sicilian or Portuguese or Polish knights are practically the same, right? You can't even see much of any particular bias, and Sicily is also at this point strongly within properly a Frankish dominated historical world that has just consolidated its essentials since the Norman conquest, right? So there is nothing really much exotic anymore. Because of the crisis followed to the War of the Vespers, you have, if anything, many Sicilians becoming mercenaries, leaving their homeland to fight in other contexts, right? We see this also in Greece after the Latin conquest. However, say, Sicily is also a much tidier place than the Balkans during this time, so there is less adventurism in militarily wise. Then we can pass to part of the iconographic / archaeological evidence that we will finish, however, at some other point because it's very extensive, reflecting actually all this beautiful, like, material culture, art, etc., that you can imagine being paralleled by an equally developed military system. One of the most beautiful sources from 10th, 11th century southern Italy are the exulted rolls. These were major rolls that were essentially unrolled, in fact, from the pulpits during the exulted, and they were literally, like, the particularity, I studied them in paleography, is that they had, of course, the images placed in a way that they could be showed to the faithful that were mostly literate, and while the priest was unrolling them, of course, the writing was upside down from his own perspective as well. And they have some, unfortunately, like, there are lots of beautiful images you can find on the internet, but they're all copyrighted. I can't use them for this kind of commercial purpose, and it's a pity because some evidence is very, very, I mean, I could use them anywhere, and nobody's going to do anything against the channel anyway about that, but they show mostly from this, mostly Lombard, but also partly Byzantine world, like how there were different styles from between the two places, paleographically and codicologically, how heavily armored the elite really was. I mean, some images are really fantastic. They're part of Romanesque art, broadly meant, in the Southern Italian context. We have beautiful imagery. There is one, for example, preserved at the John Rylands Library, the second manuscript in Manchester, depicting the crucifixion. We see a man wielding a spear with obvious wings or flanges beneath its blade. He has a straight sword with a single, slightly curved edge. The latter could be some interesting, at the end of the day, step-like, but even in origin, but also very Mediterranean in the sense, either Byzantine or Islamic, or even maybe strictly Sicilian, North African influence of sort. The reason why, because of course the non-feudal world has much less armor. The weapons that survive are, generally speaking, the ones of the elite that fight against, therefore, the more armored elite. So if you have something that cuts a lot, is not necessarily, it has this rounded tips, blade tips, not made for thrusting into armored joints, it is single edge, etc. Well, those are all indicators of a chopper, fundamentally, that would stem mostly from a military culture with less armor, which we can identify with the Islamic, with the Byzantine one, whereas instead in continental Europe, in general, you have sanitary world, mostly a straighter, double-edged blade that is ever more functional to cope with armor. So these are just examples that do not really mean too much. Some of these figures are very, very Western in many ways, but some details betray these influences. At the Tomb of Rotary, so-called, in Mount Saint Angel, this was one of the greatest Michaelic centers of cult, together with Mont Saint-Michel. After the Normans conquered southern Italy, they rekindle with the Longobards this emphoric tradition of the military saint, right? That they, both the Longobards and Normans, were very much obsessed about. And you have a carved relief. This is in the Gargano in Apulia, where in the mid-11th century, we see the arrest of Jesus. And we have a man armed only with a spear that, both for the appearance and the style of the carving itself, surely betrays some Byzantine and Islamic influence. Now, I would like to stress again that even though we will talk much about this kind of influences, it's not like southern Italy didn't have something you can categorize. Like, this series is very much based on the sense, oh look, this stuff looks similar to another one I've seen everywhere, so we mostly look at the external influences, but as far as we're concerned, this style may have been even typically Southern Italian, and the reason why it was so, it wasn't because it had been influenced by someone else in a decisive manner, but because the same reason for which among the Byzantines and the Saracens this kind of arms and armor would have been tendentially more used, which is also of course much reduced in southern Italy in comparison, would work there function. So that's kind of the obvious reason. In the Cathedral of Bari, Apulia, we can observe a carved figure on the episcopal throne. This dates to 1098. The image is somehow crude, and we can't even properly see what kind of figure this is, whether he's armored or not, whether he is wearing a hat or a fluted helmet. This is not very important. However, such headgear has clearly a cloth or turban wound around it. So this is partly some sort of southern Mediterranean or eastern Mediterranean influence. In the Church of St. Mary in the Porclaneta Valley in Magliano de Marsi, this is actually in the Abruzzi, we didn't talk much about that. there are some sort of local styles. I will start talking about these lands also in the regional series to be more specific. We have a carved altar dating to the late 11th or the 12th century. We see two interesting weapons. One is a composite recurved bow that of course has a lot of sort of Eastern Mediterranean influence. In the West we use simple bow in general, but since Roman times, with the contact with Iranian peoples, whether the Sarmatians or the Parthians, etc., the composite bow is adopted, and it remains into the late Roman army and Byzantine one. And so southern Italy, that had been priorly ruled by the Byzantines, in part retained this kind of influence. The same Muslims in part do, right? So this is also important. We see angled ears, really common to Central and Eastern Mediterranean at this point. We see a winged or flanged mace. This could really be also really straightforward Islamic influence. From here, what do we mean by Islamic? Of course, this type of stuff would have been present in North Africa, say, and maybe this style and desirable depiction was filtered through ports like Amalfi, and this even just distant relation with Islamic world. But remember that such weapons, such as composite bow, the winged or flanged mace, are sometimes coming from very far away places, as far as Central Asia, all right, Persia, and so on. So we do not know, or we say Islamic, but we've seen that even in Spain we have traces of, say, of elements in the panoply, really and possibly very close to places as far as Central Asia, right? Turkic warfare and so on, because of course the Islamic world had maintained up to quite recently this sort of open route across the Mediterranean. Only now the Westerners were essentially taking over, and still sort of maybe aesthetically, artistically replicating in such depictions. In the south portal of the Church of St. Bernardetto in Brindisi, Apulia, we have a carved relief dating to the late 11th century. In this frieze we see huntsmen, definitely mirroring a very strong Islamic influence, perhaps the greatest one in 11th century Southern Italian carvings. One guy has one tall helmet with a probable nozzle. He wields a broad-bladed spear with an apparent bamboo haft. This is very interesting because, as we know, not just broad-bladed spears are part of that sort of more chopping world without armor, but bamboo hafts are something very typical of Islamic warfare, and even more particularly of Arab military styles. We've seen this pretty much like also in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, and it's really distinctive. Also in the Byzantine army at a point, again, this material does not mean that just, an Arab had come there, and so every time you see one, that's because of it. But in a broader sense, of course, material culture, this may have been even a conventional way to depict, if not an Arab himself, however, someone who was belonging to that sphere of influence, in terms of military material culture. Plus, the same figure seems to be wearing a coat or tunic, either padded or kilted, which is basically his only armor, and indicating that lightness that is very peculiar. This guy could have been a typical North African warrior of some sort by his equipment. There are other two figures wielding short spears, one with wings or flanges. There are also ordinary tunics worn by the latter figures. this is a hunting scene. However, it's also possible that somebody would go at war just that lightly clad, which may be an indicator also, for example, a typical Caral fire hit and run tactics of also the Bedouins we've seen. This tactics had been there also in early Islamic warfare from heavier armies and so on. In any case, it's worth noticing. At the Staatliche Museen of Berlin, we have an ivory plate from southern Italy dating probably to the 11th century. These are all first of all, they're beautiful, right? The sort of Byzantine or Byzantine style, because this distinction is important. Ivories are very stylized in the typical sort of Byzantine ideal representations of sort of classical taste. So they are difficult to date. They depict actually very typically European figures, which can be easily explained by the fact that, in fact, much of this ivory plates that we can see, this is kind of Byzantine, right? They were actually made in southern Italy. And telling the truth, some of these ivories are even better, qualitatively speaking, than the Byzantine ones. If you look at the same central northern Italian art at this point, it was still very influenced by the Byzantine styles. But you see already that sort of even greater humanistic realism in the depictions, in these works, that make you realize that actually these places may have followed other people's styles by convention, but they were actually more ahead than them to begin with, and this Europeanness, this Westernness in influence is just telling you that even more. However, also in this case, there are indications of some potential Eastern Southern influence. For example, a short spear, short tunic, cross-gartered legs. This can be found in other sort of non-Western parts of the Mediterranean, the Islamic world, and beyond. There is, however, also a problem, because the figures depicted here are also very humble in clothing. And we know that especially peasant costume was very similar across so many different lands that without such specific details you couldn't even be able to distinguish them from one another. One of the most famous pieces in the history of art of the 11th century are the ivory chessmen, preserved today at the National Library of Paris in the Cabinet des Médailles. These ivory chessmen were made in southern Italy or Sicily during this time. They're really very, very beautiful, and they are really the most telling sources about 11th century southern Italian military equipment in great detail. Right? These are essentially the Italo-Norman cavalrymen that we were talking about before. I use them often in many of my videos because they're really iconic. It's a bit like the Louvre's chessmen. That's a very similar, almost contemporary correspondent to this. We do not see here just Italo-Normans. We see Italians as far as, for example, the Longobard duchies styles is concerned. There is surely some Byzantine or even strictly Islamic Sicilian evidence, right? We do realize, of course, that they're meant to represent some sort of Western horsemen, but there is also similarity, as we were saying before, between the horsemen of, say, Normandy and the ones of southern Italy to begin with, even in the Islamic world, before the Norman conquest. In fact, the fashions showed in this ivory chessmen are not particularly Western Frankish. They are similar, they're a blend. There is a lot of Byzantine and Western Islamic. as well. Surely the type of warfare is very kind of, heavy, shock-heavy cavalry, etc. There are also infantrymen, etc. But the style, the fashion per se, so the one that the same Normans of southern Italy could have adopted after having come there, like from the north, would have looked like. Remember that the French, the German crusaders looked at the Siculo-Normans and treated them a bit as Poulain, as sort of contaminated people that had lived too much close to the Muslims, and so had become infidels, right? Actually, they were some of the best crusaders ever. They were quite powerful, but again, they were perceived as differently, in part also because of this look. You can see a kite-shaped shield. This is definitely what was used in the West, but not only. In fact, as you know, that such shields may have developed, at least in parallel, during the 10th century between Germany, the Byzantine Empire, and other lands. Also the Muslims used them at a point. We see a pointed hood going right around a guy's head and chin. This was probably not an all-enveloping helmet, right? It's either a mail-coif or fabric-covered hood or hat worn over a small helmet of sort. This is interestingly close to some evidence that we have for early Islamic areas and even parts of Central Asia close to the Islamic world, which may be just a coincidence. How many ways are there to make a hood, a helmet combined? So again, not just because something similar means direct derivation or contact, whatever, never fall into this trap. However, it's also probably not just randomly the case. It's possible that here the author, the sculptor, was so being inspired by some models that he subjectively liked, or some Byzantine or Southern Italian source that we do not know. Because you have to take that into account. This is not just pure, artistic invention. They would have been inspired to other models that are lost and that we also would never know necessarily having been derived from, if we had them. And so, who knows? We see a broad, non-tapering sword of early medieval Mediterranean form without scabbard. We see a probably sleeveless cuirass or hauberk reaching to the waist. We do not know exactly what kind of armor it is, whether mail or lamellar. Lamellar cuirasses were likely typical in 11th century Byzantine armor, for example. We perhaps sort of overemphasize that because mail was probably much more around than the very stylized type of Byzantine art shows us, but surely there was lamellar armor of that kind. This could be an influence. Lamellar kept existing for a substantial amount up to even the 14th century in countries like Germany and Italy for different reasons we don't have the need to explain now. However, just saying that you could find them also in very different contexts from just a Byzantine influenced one, just per se. We see a round shield, a broadsword. We see no sword belt in one case. The scabbard worn outside a hauberk. The hauberk including a coif, which seems at least very like lamellar. We see a lamellar cuirass, a lamellar aventail as a good possibility. However, we do not see much of this specifically in the 11th century Central Mediterranean, which also doesn't mean that could have not been there. Again, there are not too many ways you can make an armor or a helmet or a shield or whatever. We see also an ordinary male hauberk that would have been really normal. In any case, a low domed helmet, perhaps fluted with some kind of separate rim. There is some slightly different lower edge curving from the typical European helmets. That could be another indicator of some more local style. It really does look like a bassinet, telling the truth. And there is a great deal of evidence that points to the fact that the bassinet may have developed in some region of the Mediterranean, not necessarily in Europe, to eventually develop in the later medieval form. We've seen striking prototypes in contemporary Spain that was apparently a very advanced and sort of at least very experimental place in terms of arms and armor, specific metallurgical skills, etc. And we were aware that the bassinet was around conceptually from many centuries before it sort of came around to be what it is. Naturally, understanding the various affiliations of helmets of armor types is not easy at all, but we try to an extent. We see a slightly pointed helmet with a nozzle, which also comes down over the sides and back of his head, which is, again, very similar to the later bassinet. Extra protection. We do not understand, again, whether this is an artistic license whatsoever, but it's possible that, of course, this type of helmets existed. We see the lower rim probably attached to an aventail. However, it's possible that also a helmet worn over a mailcoif and hauberk was more typical of this time. We see a short-sleeved male hauberk, which is also typical of some, Sicilian, Middle Eastern world, especially with the coming to the waist, having a flap down the front. We see a broad sword of that sort of non-European type, or this that they were present also in Europe, of course, and also in Italy. They lasted for a long time, and they existed also in other parts of the continent. But tendentially, they reflected that sort of lighter type of armor around, which is odd when you realize that some of these places were also very much advanced in metallurgy and actually very heavily armored in some cases. So this, of course, makes you aware of the fact you shouldn't simply be that dichotomic, saying, okay, so in this place you see a broad-bladed sword, so more cutting, less armor. Not necessarily, also because some very broad-bladed swords, depending on how much the weight, how the weight is distributed, they can do very different things also against armor, telling the truth. We see a shield in the guise of a very tall kite-shaped mantlet. We see something similar in Italy and even the Middle East. We talked about the Januvia in the Levant that take the name after the fact that during the Crusades that the Genoese used this, and this is in the Arabic local tongue. So we never really made last summer a pretty thorough series about central northern Italian warfare and showing how much was autochtonously produced, possibly coming to influence Levantine arms and armor rather than the usual idea. The Westerners took the stuff from the East during the Crusades, kind of story that actually doesn't hold water the more research goes on. Remember that Europe was overwhelmingly more advanced, especially at this time, than in those places. At the Museum of Fine Arts of Boston, we have the piece 57.58L that is displaying a centaur on a carved oliphant. This comes from likely Salerno. We think it's Campania in general, dating to the 11th century. It's around there. I mean, these styles were very common in Amalfi, Salerno, Sorrento, etc. Salerno was a Longobard principality, albeit on the sea, very difficult to take. There is the Arichis strong castle that is, showing you how also like the steep mountains on the Mediterranean Sea in southern Italy can really be a pretty nasty, position to storm. Ask the Allies in World War II. It's an interesting figure because of the centaur idea to begin with. We see, however, so the idea of a horse archer to begin with, the mace is present. This may be some sort of Byzantine or Islamic influence in southern Italy that would have, however, used maces, as maces were present also elsewhere, and that actually speak of heavy armor. And the reason why this is associated with this Byzantine Islamic warfare that, as we said, is actually lighter, is on average, meaning that the mace is more specifically used by especially that sort of steppe elite that is ultra heavily armored but is also very numerically elite as well. And so it's also sometimes just a symbol of power or whatever. I talk about bludgeoning weapons in other videos. You can check that out for further explanation. At the National Library of Paris, we have a carved elephant. This is a horn, right? From the Chartreuse des Portes. It comes from Campania, mid-11th century. It's believed to be a Saracenic workmanship, but as we explained before, it's possible it was made actually by local Italians imitating that. In fact, if you think even about, the Palatine Chapel in Palermo, like we see Saracenic style, but it's not like we know that there were actually Saracen craftsmen to do that. And like actually the local Sicilians would have been even more advanced, as we were pointing out before, even with Byzantine art than the original sort of style. It could have been, this elephant could have been made in Amalfi, for example. It's just a speculation. You can see a horseman depicted holding a short spear, which is yet another indicator of some sort of more javelin skirmishing kind of cavalry rather than the shock charge one of the typical Western world. What is fascinating is, of course, the fact that not necessarily, again, these guys would have represented the typical horseman, or even just the most important one, of course, but it may just be like a style, maybe just aesthetically finding its place here. We see a long cloth arriving to the chest and billowing out behind the shoulders, which is very similar to some 12th century Middle Eastern types. It's also seen in aforementioned Palatine Chapel. We have Longobard legal books, the Leges Longobardorum, so the Rothary Edict plus the later editions. This manuscript is preserved at the archives of the Badia of the Holy Trinity in Cava dei Tirreni. This is the code number 4, and we have at folio 192 this very interesting sort of pre-Norman Southern Italian look of a trooper. This dates to the 11th century fundamentally. There's a lot of Islamic influence. For example, we can see a tiraz band around the arm that we've seen very often in Islamic warfare. Also, like the Mamluk period shows a lot of that very neatly from the Basin of Saint Louis, etc. But these were essentially sort of recognition badges, almost uniforms. There were probably also writings on it. We see it as west here as southern Italy / Sicily. There is a broad but slightly tapering sword that points to, however, some kind of, again, tapering that is anti-armor thrusting capacity, let's say, which is, however, roughly similar to others we see in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, maybe up to India. In fact, the Arabs would import the same word for the highly prized Saif al-Hind, that is to say the Indian sword, in their tongue, that, as you know, was very prized because of the wood steel, like how they used monsoons to insufflate this enormous furnaces that could reach, in fact, because of this constant wind, monsonic winds that maintain always that regular insufflation. That is extremely important. Reaching the furnace making the furnace reach much higher temperatures that would help working much better steel, essentially. It's a bit like the Toledo kind of the Damascene steel boots kind of techniques. They were scattered all over. There were different reasons why one region would be able to make better or worse. We see multiple rivets on a small round or oval shield held by internal straps. This is very similar to North Africa, Al-Andalus. Definitely we don't see this, say, in central northern Italy or in the rest of Europe. Have yet another carved oliphant of the same pack, let's say late 11th century southern Italy or Sicily, preserved let's say this is from a private collection on loan. I don't know whether still, but it was at a point this to the Victoria and Albert Museum of London. This elephant has a 17th century silver mount, which unfortunately obscures the upper part of the ivory figure. However, we can see still most of this definitely Islamic inspired kind of art. We see short-sleeved, probably male shirt, continuing likely inside the waist, sash, and skirt. It's also typically, again, Islamic. You see a deeply convex shield, sword without quillon. This is typically either Sicilian or North African, as seen in the other video. We have a very famous manuscript, Rabanus Maurus Encyclopedia, made in Campania in 1023, preserved at the Abbey Library of Monte Cassino, manuscript 132. There are lots of interesting illuminations, some of which are also the ones of the aforementioned very heavily armored soldiers. It's also somehow relatively less known as beautiful source, like the Exultats, by the way. There is plenty of information about traditional arms and armor in this pre-Norman southern Italy. That is, however, still a bit difficult to interpret because the style is artistically very beautiful, but we often don't understand what's like the pattern behind that and how much this, of course, corresponds to actual panoply and general warfare. Shields are round or oval, deeply complex. Male hauberks are short-sleeved and slit the sides or front, and are seen with and without coif. One may actually be represented having a bent tail, just the art sometimes is too crude to get whether that's an actual iron tail or not. The helmets are the most complicated element here, because they seem to have rings or buttons on top. We see male coif or hoods or caps worn over possible elements. The latter type, the hoods, are very similar to Byzantine or Turco-Iranian style. We see some possible variation of some original Roman helmet that, however, doesn't necessarily reflect any current reality. Other helmets are sort of more up-to-date, more realistic. One, for example, seems to be conical, without a crown, two-piece in construction seemingly, which is a bit similar to what you see in other parts of early medieval Southern Europe. You see wings, with or without flanges, javelins, spears, javelin heads. Swords are of the broad, early medieval Mediterranean form, normally with short, straight guillon. We see curved, round, typical early medieval European trefoil pommels. A bow, an arrow. Some of these weapons are described in a survey, for example, javelins and spears, in this case about low issues. We see daggers. One is a sort of work knife with a curved blade. Other three have tapering, almost triangular blades. This just suggests also some sort of anti-armor capacity of considerable level. One has a rounded tip and a tear-shaped pommel, however. Others look instead similar to other Southern Italian evians, or also other Central Mediterranean types, something that would have later evolved into a basilard. We see long bear-like pommels on them, some of which are very distinctive. They may seem some sort of basilard, right? Except again that the rounded tip in some ways is not really what the entire weapon had to be made for. In any case, we see in this context probably more armor than we think, especially in this sort of Longbard reality. It would have not been strange at all. Actually, we think that the Longobards may have had pretty heavy armor, surely the heavier of the entire region. We will continue with this in another video. We'll finish it in another episode. There's no need for a third one. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.